Hello, welcome back. We are going to start that afternoon session. Thank you for being here. With a panel chaired by my colleague and also a co-organizer of the conference, Alison Holm. Alison is a professor at NOVA BHRE, and she has worked a lot on responsible business conduct, especially with the OECD perspective, looking at the OECD guidelines and special instances of before the OECD national contact points. Thank you so much, Alison, for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you this year again and being part of organizing this together. And I will let Alison then introduce the panel. The panelist, Olena, missed her plane this morning. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here in person, but we'll have her online. So yeah, I'll pass the floor to Alison now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm Alison Holm. I'm an assistant professor and researcher at NOVA School of Business and Economics. Very happy to represent the School of Business alongside my colleagues Jenny, I see Karina here, and also some of our students who are youth ambassadors today. So thanks a lot for the invitation, Claire. And I've really been enjoying the beginning of this conference. This panel is entitled Taking Appropriate Measures to Address Adverse Impacts, and we have a very nice set of panelists today with us. First, Grace Camara. She is the Senior Legal Advisor and the Garment and Apparel Sector Lead for Global Rights Compliance, an international human rights law and development firm based in The Hague. And she also is a UK qualified lawyer with more than 15 years experience advising on corporate accountability initiatives. We also have Jenny Hoobler, professor of human resource management at NOVA School of Business and Economics, and also academic director of the Leadership for Impact Knowledge Center. Jenny's research focuses on diversity and inclusion, and particularly focusing on women's career. We also have with us João Dias-Mestre, Head of Sustainability, João Dias-Mestre, Head of Sustainability of Fidelidade Group. João started as a consultant at BCG, working in multiple different industries and also across different geographies. And in 2015, he joined Fidelidade Group as Head of Business Development Department and then Head of Corporate Strategy before taking on his current role as Head of Sustainability in 2022. Olena Uvarova is joining us online. She's an associate professor at Yaroslav Mudryi National Law University in the Ukraine, and she's also a visiting researcher at Wageningen University Law Group. She leads the International Lab on Business and Human Rights at her university. And finally, I will present Caroline Lichuma, who is our keynote speaker today. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Human Rights, Erlangen, Nuremberg, and her current research focuses on regulatory developments in business and human rights and their impacts on Global South stakeholders. Caroline is going to introduce our panel today through her keynote speech. And we will then follow with a panel discussion and then a Q&A. Thank you, Caroline. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So in the interest of trying to keep to time, I will start a little timer so that I can not give you too many stories and get straight to the point. I'm very excited to be here at NOVA BHRE. The other panels that we've had so far have been already so illuminating and enriching. You know, it's a special credit to Claire and all the organizers having brought so many different stakeholders to have this discussion, because if there's one thing we know about the CHREN and mandatory human rights due diligence laws is that we can't approach it in our unique professional silos. We need to all of us have more of these kinds of open conversations. So our panel is going to think about taking appropriate measures to address the adverse impacts. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of a map of how I plan to set the stage for what is going to be a very exciting panel and very different contributions from very diverse speakers, by first thinking about what are adverse impacts within the context of the EU CHREN. So true to the lawyer in me, I think it's important to get into the detail of So what does appropriate mean within the context of the CSDDD? What do adverse impacts mean? And then put them all together to see how can we be able to or understand the company's obligations to take appropriate measures to deal with adverse impacts, and of course, focusing on meaningful stakeholder engagement as an integral part of this particular process. So to begin with, I mean, kind of just reminding you of the conversations we had before lunch, where some of the other panelists, especially Chiara, talked about the fact that the EU CSDDD sets up a very interesting regime where it considers both human rights adverse impacts as well as environmental adverse impacts. These are separated, right? And in the previous panels so far, we haven't really talked about transposition and the opportunities that are still available within the context of transposition, but I'd like to begin my little discussion here by contextualizing the fact that, remember that for the most part, the CSDDD provides a minimum harmonization rule. So there's still room for governments to go further and to set even higher standards than those that have been set forward by the CSDDD. So, of course, I'd encourage us in whatever context or capacity we can to still continue pushing for some of the things that we were pushing for even before we had the directive actually being adopted. So when thinking about adverse human rights and environmental impacts under the CSDDD, we have to go back to the annex and to look at how the annex has set up whatever obligations companies are going to be expected to cover. But even more than that, and not to rehash what was already mentioned, remember that there's an emphasis on both actual and potential adverse impacts, right? So I think this is an important conversation that has already been mentioned by prior panelists, the fact that the way that due diligence architecture is being set up, it's trying to, create a situation where companies will both be proactive as well as reactive, so that they can try to prevent these adverse impacts. But when the adverse impacts have already arisen, they can try to mitigate their impacts, stop them, and remediate as the case may actually be. So I think that's already something that has been referred to as well. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the dual measures or the dual nature of what I consider to be appropriate measures under the CSDDD. So the CSDDD in its section 3.0 talks about appropriate measures, and it tries to give a definition of what will be considered to be appropriate as a measure. And of course, if you ask any lawyer, or if you're a lawyer like me and anyone asks you a question, you always give a "it depends" kind of answer, because lawyers don't give straight answers, hardly ever, unless they're forced to, right? And the CSDDD is similar in this sort of way. It says that, well, appropriate measures will always depend on the context. And then it tries to list a couple of things that could help us to kind of come up with a context against which we can say whether a company has acted appropriately in dealing with the adverse impacts or not. So some of the things that companies are expected to do that will then be considered to be appropriate in this regard will be dealing with questions of the severity and likelihood, right? And this, Francesco, I think, mentioned in his discussion that within the context of identifying and prioritizing the human rights and environmental risks, it's impossible to do everything at once. So you will be considered to have acted appropriately if you identified and prioritized according to the severity and likelihood of the risk in question. And then there's also questions of the fact that companies have to take consideration of their unique context within which they operate. And you'll see this from some of the panelists that we have, right? If you think about companies operating in conflict areas, something that Olena will talk about, companies operating in conflict areas have to perhaps model their due diligence appropriately to deal with their particular context. Or if you're a company that faces the risk of invisible workers, such as domestic workers, as Jenny is going to discuss, you might have to adapt your due diligence context in order to actually deal with this particular risk. So the point is there's no one-size-fits-all of what can be considered to be an appropriate measure. In fact, this will depend on the unique context and circumstances of the company within the context of their operations. Now, let's talk about meaningful stakeholder engagement. Now, if you followed the processes of coming up with the CSDDD, I think the beginning of the year was a roller coaster. Now we can all breathe and say, okay, we have a CSDDD. But at the beginning of the year, for some time, it looked as though we might not have a directive, right? Because at the last minute, some powerful countries came in and tried to water down the directive, and even to, perhaps not get the support we need for the directive to come into effect. Thankfully, that happened. And if you've been following the discussions in terms of coming up with a directive, you know that there have been different versions of the directive, and provisions have evolved across the different versions. So for instance, in the European Commission version, we didn't have a provision on meaningful stakeholder engagement. They only had this formulation of, let's have stakeholder engagement where relevant. And of course, there was a lot of pushback from academia, from policy, from stakeholders themselves, and then we ended up with the directive in its current form that has a provision on meaningful stakeholder engagement in Article 13. So this is a significant development in as far as the CSDDD is actually concerned, and in as far as setting up the architecture within which the due diligence process will actually be carried out. Now, meaningful stakeholder engagement is anticipated in several parts of the due diligence process, and if you look at Article 13, this is actually spelled out. But I think even more importantly, there's a promise in the law, or an obligation in the law, that companies will not just say they have meaningfully engaged when they haven't, right? So there's certain things that are set up that companies have to do. Companies have to give information to stakeholders, adequate information for them to be able to meaningfully engage. Companies have to try and make sure that barriers that stakeholders usually face in terms of being able to meaningfully engage are overcome, right? So the fear of retaliation, of retribution, and stuff like that. Companies have to do as much as possible within this particular provision to be able to try and ensure that really the engagement is actually meaningful. Now, the meaningful engagement provision is important, but it's not the only provision that creates a space for stakeholders to actually take part in this process of dealing with the adverse impacts. There's a provision in Article 14 on the notification and complaints mechanism, so stakeholders can be able to give an early warning to the company that, hey, we think that there's a risk of adverse impacts here. That's also very important, thinking about the preventative angle. And then there's also the provision in terms of the supervisory authorities, that stakeholders can be able to give substantiated claims to supervisory authorities and say, under Article 26 of the directive, that there's a particular risk that is actually occurring in this particular context in the company, and the authorities can be able to take action in this particular regard. So basically, the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a whole framework that has been set up that due diligence will be carried out not just by a company alone with its doors closed, but in association with numerous stakeholders as identified in Article 3N of the EU CSDDD, right? Because it tries to give an explanation of who are these stakeholders. We have the company's employees, we have the employees of the business partners, we have their legitimate representatives, indigenous people, human rights defenders, basically a sort of wide enough list of people that multiple actors will be involved in the due diligence process. And because I now have about 1 minute to wrap up, I will finish by saying that when we think about meaningful stakeholder engagement as part of due diligence processes, it's not a favor that the company is doing the stakeholders. It's something that companies should do. And I'll add to the reasons that other contributors have already given for why meaningful stakeholder engagement is so important. One, they're value-based reasons. There's a human right inherent in recognizing the autonomy of stakeholders, in allowing them to take part in decision-making processes that will affect their material well-being. It's a question of rights, right? Like the right to participation, which is a recognized human right within the context of the human right framework. Even more than that, there are instrumental reasons for having stakeholder engagement. Who best to help the company make decisions than the people on the ground, right? If the company wants to have at its disposal the best possible kind of information with which to map its risk and with which to be able to come up with necessary actions in order to, identify, prioritize, mitigate, address adverse impacts, then who best to consult than actual stakeholders of the company? So as the rest of my panelists will show, while this varies depending on the context of the company, like the exact processes that the company will take in terms of what will be appropriate measures, what remains constant is that for companies to actually be able to take appropriate measures to address adverse impacts, meaningful stakeholder engagement must be an integral part of this process. So thank you very much, and let's listen to our excellent contributions now.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for opening the session and also so elegantly making the transition from the former panel, which also mentioned meaningful stakeholder engagement, a lot in relation to identifying risks, towards our panel, which is about taking appropriate measures. First, maybe I can turn to Grace and try to, maybe you can give us a bit of an overview or walk us through what it means to take appropriate measures to address adverse impacts based on your experience with the garment industry and living wages in particular.
Thanks, Alison, for the introduction, and thank you, Caroline, for the keynote. Yeah, I thought I would try and contextualize this conversation with some very concrete examples of what we at Global Rights Compliance are seeing on the ground, both feedback from suppliers, but also the international garment brands that I work with and advise. I think it's important to do that because oftentimes these conversations can feel a little bit nebulous. To give some examples of some of the challenges that the different stakeholders are facing, depending oftentimes on the tier that you're looking at within the supply chain. And of course, as Alison said, I'll use the living wage gap as an example. So I manage the garment, apparel and textile portfolio for Global Rights Compliance. We work with brands, international, some of the big international brands, some smaller brands as well, mainly based in the EU and in the US. And obviously they are obliged to, but they're also very keen to map their supply chains, understand, the impact of their business, and support suppliers to make better choices as far as workers. I focus mainly on labor rights. And when you talk about adverse impacts within the garment sector, if you think about your average factory in Bangladesh, in India, in Pakistan, for example, there are some sort of recurring key risks that we're seeing on recurring key risks, essentially. So these tend to be things like forced overtime, the living wage gap, as I mentioned, gender-based violence, freedom of association being minimized because of risk of retaliation. There are many others, but these are sort of the key ones. When it comes to the living wage gap, I think it's a good example of where addressing an adverse impact is very difficult. There are so many different factors to address the gap between a minimum wage, which companies are obliged to pay, and what it actually costs to live a decent life, especially in these countries. So I thought I would use that as an example. I mean, we have, for example, the economic pressures. If you are in a country such as Pakistan, where you have hyperinflation, where you have weak constitutional structures, committing to pay a living wage to your workers is a commitment that you may not really, in essence, want to make. And this is the kind of the push and pull tension that we're seeing between this, the idealistic viewpoint of the CHREN and other regulations and actually the reality on the ground. It's very difficult over a long period of time to commit to pay your workers a certain wage, even though it's the right thing to do when you're in an economic environment that's very unpredictable. So for that reason, we work with brands to try and help them understand how they can address the issue, maybe not fixing the issue, and this goes back to what Caroline said about the obligation of means rather than outcomes, which is the intention of the CHREN, to address the issue and engage in stakeholder dialogue. Now, interestingly enough, when it comes to living wages, and another issue around addressing the living wage gap is that if you come together as brands to do that, you could be seen as being colluding, as there are anti-competition, anti-competitive issues, antitrust issues related to that kind of dialogue. So a lot of brands shy away from collectively agreeing to address this issue. This is around living wages. It doesn't mean they shouldn't do that. It doesn't mean the EU can't, and they very much should, with transposition, look at this issue and really put out a position to say, look, if you are trying to address a sustainability issue such as the living wage, that will not be deemed competitive. Like that, those sorts of decisions in reality really do help brands to come together and actually address this issue and stop using excuses. That's just one example of where, an adverse impact with all the best intention can actually be very difficult to address. Another issue that you're seeing, if you look at the average factory, they have multiple suppliers, they have multiple, they source multiple brands, so they supply to multiple brands. So in the CHREN, there's talk about, when it comes to living wages, using your influence, using your leverage to make to address the issue, to have conversations. Well, actually, a lot of brands don't have that much leverage. We always assume when we think about the big fast fashion brands that they can do whatever they want. Well, that's probably true, but that's not the average brand. So the average brand is a small family-owned German business that makes workwear, and supply sources that from a factory in Pakistan. So they don't necessarily have a huge amount of influence and leverage, which is what is mandated in the CHREN. So what do they do in that case? So it's good to have that kind of language. It creates this dialogue. We can start having the conversation. But the reality is, in practice, what does leverage really mean? What does influence really mean? If you are 5% of a factory's supply, you don't really have much leverage. You can't dictate wages and salaries. Another issue that we're seeing, and suppliers are feeding this back, is that there are so many different, in the garment sector, there are so many different compliance, checkboxes, audit measures that you can take, and the average factory will maybe have 10 to 15 brands that they're supplying to, and each one is asking for something different. So for them, this is a huge resource. They're having to comply with a different methodology each time, and it's actually costing them a lot of money in terms of resourcing. And we're hearing that they're redirecting funds towards that away from workers. Now, that's probably an excuse, but that's what they're saying is happening. So, understanding the realities on the ground, but also amplifying the supplier's voice, actually having those conversations with suppliers. Suppliers are in a very difficult position in that they don't want to lose contracts, so they'll often just go with the status quo and they won't want to ruffle any feathers. So to get them to speak, to build that kind of trust, we've had to do that as Global Rights Compliance. I think we've done that very well, but that's not every stakeholder that can do that. So bearing in mind that while we want to make these changes, actually bringing stakeholders into the conversation can have actually negative repercussions for them. They can lose business. So how do you have those conversations but also protecting their position as well as the workers' positions as well? I'll just end with a couple of very practical solutions, or at least attempts at solutions that we found are really helpful for brands and when we're advising brands. So we'll often say things like, if you have a code of conduct, make sure it's a two-way code of conduct. You're not putting all the onus on your supplier, expecting them to make all these changes. Make sure that you as the brand are supporting them to do that. And that can be through funding, it can be through capacity building, it can be through dialogue or reassuring them with longer-term contracts. These are things that will put the suppliers in a position to actually invest in making changes, invest in their workers. They're more likely to do that if your purchasing practices are more amenable to them making those changes. Another thing that we often advise as well is that with the suppliers, you really, if you're going to do a social audit, you don't sort of just rely on the outcome, but you actually follow up. So a lot of the time they'll do these ethical audits, they'll look at labor rights, and obviously some issues will come up, and you have a corrective action plan. Well, we can tell you that 90% of the time there's nobody to monitor the implementation of that correction action plan. Whether 12 months down the line any changes have been made, there's really no one tasked with that role to tell you whether that's happened or not. So it's not a bad intention necessarily, it's literally just lack of resources. So to make sure there's follow through, with that kind of process as well is really important, but also not just relying on social audits, obviously, as a kind of panacea that's going to fix everything. And then I'll finish off very quickly with a really good example. We run a program in Pakistan looking at the garment sector, ready-made garment sector, which is a very fast-moving sector, very big. One of the things that we've seen is, there are people do want to make a change. People do want to, they do want to do something about these issues. But oftentimes you'll see legislation like CHREN, it's very top down. It's very sort of global north. And it gets sort of lost in the weeds when you try to translate what this actually means in practice. So really making the effort to train, to have training, to socialize these issues so that suppliers, not just in factories, but also beyond, in the smallholders in the cotton fields, can actually understand what this means for them, and making and facilitating that through data transfer, through systems which allow people to share information in a confidential way around wages, around workers' workers' profiles and that kind of thing. Looking at more granular issues like worker participation committees. You may have a committee, but does it actually do anything? Is it really viable? Not just a tick box exercise to say that you have one. Have you read the minutes? Have they actually met? You know, those sorts of questions, very practical, granular approaches, I think really makes a difference. And then I just want to end very quickly because I think a really good comment was made earlier in the day by a lady from the UN Global Compact around, you know, the fact that a lot of businesses that we work with actually do want to make this change. And I work with some very dedicated sustainability managers and people, you know, small teams. They tend to be small teams, but they're very, very committed and dedicated to making this change. So I don't think the issue is necessarily with the companies not wanting to do something. It really is about providing them with very practical guidance and incentives to make those changes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Grace. Very insightful and also very practice-oriented. I think we learned a lot of tools that could help actually address or take appropriate measures to address these challenges. Now I wanted to pass it on to Jenny, who will inform us also on something that Grace also mentioned, the reality on the ground, those that don't, whose voices are not often heard. You're going to inform us on a category that you've identified in your work, invisible workers. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Alison, and thanks to everyone on the panel. So I'm a business school researcher, but it's so nice to be with all of you. I may use a bit of a different language than some of you use to talk about some of these issues, but be assured that there are business school researchers who care very deeply about these issues. I'm an American, but I'm also a permanent resident of South Africa. I first went to South Africa on a Fulbright in 2011-2012, and my Fulbright project was to study women leaders of Johannesburg Stock Exchange listed companies. But I quickly became way more interested in the massive domestic labor workforce that exists in South Africa. There's an estimate that 1 in 5 women who are employed in South Africa are employed in this largely invisible yet hugely ubiquitous workforce. Mostly maids, some nannies, some what are called tea ladies, people who serve drinks to people in corporations and workplaces, and I study women in work, and domestic work really is a women's workforce. 80% of domestic workers worldwide are women, and they're often hired by women when it's an informal workplace relationship. The numbers are really hard to come by worldwide, but the ILO estimates that there are certainly over 100 million informally employed domestic workers worldwide. Especially in developing nations, domestic workers support themselves, but not only themselves, but usually their families and their extended families on the wages that they earn. They often are moving nationally, but also internationally to find work. For example, about 2.1 million Filipino domestic workers are living in the Middle East currently. And this is an invisible, which makes it a potentially high job, high-risk job for adverse impacts, but it's also a highly necessary workforce. It's invisible because a lot of it takes place in the informal economy, really a handshake between a domestic worker and often a woman who hires her to balance her work and family. So oftentimes there are no employment contracts, no nation-state protections like health and safety protections, minimum wage and hour protections, no sick leave. And in many nations, it's undocumented women who do the work, who may be fearful of reporting abuses due to wage insecurity, but fear of deportation as well. So it's invisible, but it's also, as I said, highly necessary. And here's the business angle. Almost everywhere, jobs are still structured under this antiquated model of one primary breadwinner who goes out to work and earns an income, and one person, the partner who stays home and cares for household and family. But this old model really doesn't work anymore. Dual career families are now the norm in most countries. And most nation states are doing an inadequate job of stepping up with required family supports like paid childcare, extended paid family leaves. And employers are not adequately filling this gap. Most employees don't see themselves as even having a role in the health and prosperity of the workers who we hire to help our workers. So families are left scrambling, trying to patch together inadequate solutions to meet what we expect and what we call the ideal worker expectation, where you're available to work anytime, anywhere, as requested by your employer. So this creates a real demand for what work and family scholars like myself call scaffolding. Trying to keep the family upright with solutions that will help us balance work and family, and domestic workers fill this really critical gap. Because family support or scaffolding is often inadequate for parents, but also people like myself who have recently scrambled to design elder care solutions for sick family members, that's where we have to outsource or scaffold. And this becomes the responsibility of domestic workers. But I know that most of you don't want to be scaffolding on the backs of low socioeconomic women and immigrant workers. Most employing women express reliance on their domestic workers and also express a great deal of gratitude for the role that they fill in their lives. But few people who hire domestic workers individually take the time to structure the relationship in ways that we ourselves would expect out of an employment relationship. For example, receiving job training, receiving performance evaluations, periodic wage increases, paid sick and holiday leaves. And so when I think of this reliance on domestic work, in general, I see it as a real system failure. Work has to be structured in a way where it's possible for workers to do well in the home and the family domain without having to engage in low-wage employment of domestic workers. But I know that domestic workers rely on these jobs for themselves and for their family members, so I'm not saying don't hire them. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think there are lots of potential solutions to this problem. And there's potential solutions for the many stakeholders, businesses, governments, and for us, usually women who hire other women to help us balance work and family. First, for corporations and businesses who can afford it, they should be systematizing family support. And this is going to be controversial, but I would say that businesses should employ domestic workers so their employees aren't having to hire our own employees just to be able to do our own jobs. Some rich corporations are able to do this, but most are not. It's very rare. And so we want to do this so no one's forced to engage in low-wage work and work without labor protections. In general, companies just sort of look the other way and expect individuals to come up with solutions that work for them and their families. Also, another stakeholder is governments, governments should follow EU directives and other mandates about care arrangements, but also I think governments need to do a better job of encouraging public-private partnerships for employers to get their employees needed work-family support, but also for governments to fast-track immigrants with work visas and protections. Governments can also support labor collectives where women can act in solidarity across employers for higher wages and working conditions and for demanding a living wage. For example, the International Domestic Workers Federation is a collective of about 500,000 members across 54 countries, and that organization has won labor standards for domestic workers in more than 28 countries. Finally, for those of us who may employ domestic workers, we have to start acting like the employers that we are. If you have an employee you need to create a real job for her. Paid sick leave, time off, performance appraisals, and a living wage. There are lots of tools out there to calculate what a living wage is. Don't just rely on what your neighbor is paying a domestic worker. Factor in the amount of people your worker is supporting in her own home, the cost of living, the changes in costs of living, etc. A lot of those living wage calculators are free and easily available online. So despite where you are on the socioeconomic scale, I think we all want to be valued, we want to be heard, we want to be seen, we want human rights at work. And so please don't forget about amplifying the voices of others who may not have those same privileges that you do. And act responsibly in your corner of the world would be my advice.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for adding this slightly different perspective. We're used to thinking of due diligence along the supply chain in a very horizontal manner, and we often also make somewhat of a difference between contexts. So you have usually the European context or a Western context, and then another context out there. And supposedly we're doing better, but when you add this vertical point of view, it opens up a new perspective of thinking about due diligence, maybe also in terms of integrating those support systems that exist in our Western context that are supposedly better, but that involve people who are not protected already here. So I think that was a very important complementary point. Talking about stakeholders that not only because they are invisible, but also because they have to face extreme negative disruption. I'm going to open the floor now to Olena's intervention. Is she online, Anna? Yes, okay. So Olena is going to talk to us about situations of ardent conflicts and other high-risk contexts, and how can companies take appropriate measures to address adverse impacts in those very disrupted, heavily negatively disrupted contexts. Olena, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm very sorry that I'm not with you today in person, my congratulations to organizers, to Claire, and to many other people in the room. I would be happy to meet you in person, but probably, hopefully next time. I would like to mention, to emphasize several points related to armed conflict, but also other challenging context. First of all, as Celine today said that we need 3R, I would say that we also need to see. First of all, conceptualization, and when I mention conceptualization, I mean not just in academic way, but also for providing certain regulation for companies and certain expectation for state regulations. And when we talk about armed conflict or other high-risk context, and when we go to corporate sustainability due diligence directive, we can find armed conflict and other high-risk context in the recitals in paragraph 42, but if we read this paragraph carefully, we could be quite confused. Why? Because actually in this paragraph, from one side, the directive is talking about conflict affected and high risk areas, but from other side, it focuses only on international humanitarian law and on Geneva Conventions, and it makes the text of directive quite narrow. because it seems that directive is going to limit all high-risk areas with armed conflict, but at the same time, and today in previous sessions, it was also mentioned, and speakers of this session also mentioned that companies, of course, could operate in different challenging contexts. And in this regard, I think that actually we need this conceptualization for much more clear understanding of what do we mean when we talk about heightened human rights due diligence. Do we mean only situation of armed conflict? And in this case, we need to make a focus on international humanitarian law and what could be companies' contribution into the dynamic of the conflict and what triggers, what drivers, what powers are involved in the armed conflict, and how companies could influence directly or indirectly, and so on. Or do we mean much more broad understanding of high risk areas and much more broad understanding of challenging contexts? I think that this particular issue comes from the text of UN guiding principles, because if we take UN guiding principles, we can also find the mentioning of conflict affected areas and heightened risks for human rights in this kind of areas. But also we need to provide, I would say, dynamic interpretation of UN guiding principles, not just yes, take it as a static text. And this dynamic interpretation should take us to broad understanding of challenging context. So my first point is that we need to develop a much more clear understanding of heightened human rights due diligence and to make a difference between heightened human rights due diligence in armed conflict, which links with international humanitarian law, and heightened human rights due diligence in the other challenging contexts. And in both situations, we need um, to call companies to assess and to identify not just human rights risks which they create in their operations, in their chains of activities, but also human rights risks which are created by this emergency situation or by this challenging context, and to assess how company could minimize this negative impact of this situation on human rights. So it is the similarity between all these kind of challenging context. And Another C, I would say that it's contextualization, and many speakers already mentioned this. Of course, this is a cross-cutting principle of UN guiding principles and of corporate sustainability due diligence directive. But in situation of armed conflict or other challenging situations, contextualization is the most important scene, and this contextualization is not possible without meaningful stakeholders engagement. And again, this is a very challenging task for companies to ensure meaningful stakeholders engagement in situation of armed conflict or other high-risk situations. But without this stakeholders engagement, of course, companies are not able to provide all possible adequate, reasonable efforts to minimize human risks in these situations. My last point that even when we are talking about armed conflicts, we also should not limit heightened human rights due diligence just with international humanitarian law, despite of the importance of this component of heightened human rights due diligence for the situation of armed conflict. But in particular, the situation in Ukraine shows clearly that this contextualization should indicate a much more broad list of human rights risks for companies. For example, it's physical safety. Does company provide, safety for employees in the situation of dangerous emergency? Does company provide access to shelters or provide other options to ensure safety of employees? Issues of mental health, issues of access to essential foods, for essential goods and services, and many other things. Which should be taken into consideration by companies and which are not linked directly to their operations, but they are linked directly to the context where they operate.
Thank you very much, Olena, again for first of all for your participation still, even though in these circumstances, and very much also for the context that you provide. Again, we're contextualizing. Caroline explicitly mentioned there's no one size fits all, and now we're actually going through different kinds of contexts, and we're seeing the different levels of complexity that firms are facing, and we're also bringing some solutions as to what could be made easier for addressing these adverse impacts through appropriate measures. Now, João will also say a word about the role of insurance companies in this process, which is very well related also to these high-risk contexts that Olena just mentioned. João?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And just a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer nor an expert in human rights, but I'll try to give a business view on the topic. First, a brief introduction of Fidelidade, so that we are all in the same page. So we are the largest insurance company in Portugal, but also present in 13 countries across Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. We have 2 million clients in Portugal, 9 million abroad. And for Fidelidade, there is a clear ambition to be a leader in sustainability. And I would start to say that usually for us to be leader in something in a company, it's crucial to have the appropriate incentives in place. And so for us, it's something that we have been doing for some years so that everybody in the company has concrete incentive schemes that include topics related with sustainability. And we believe that this is a good first step so that we can then start doing things in a company. We also started with the CSRD double materiality assessment that we already talked today to understand what are the key topics, because we are talking about 10 topics, 37 subtopics. So it's very, very intense exercise for a company to do, especially in an industry such as ours, financial industry, very indirect interaction with its customers. So we started with that so that we can firstly understand in the social topics, namely human rights, but also environment and governance, obviously, what are the relevant topics in terms of impact and in terms of risk and opportunities. And for that, we, as it's supposed to do, we have engaged with stakeholders as we discussed today. And for us, it was a very rich interaction from NGOs to the Association of Insurers to clients. And it was a very rich input for the exercise we were doing. And we defined the social topics as the most material for us, considering that being an insurance company, basically our operation is to insure companies and individuals in adverse situations, either climate, social, health, so all those type of circumstances. So obviously we can play a vital role in a social dimension. We work basically as a safety net when people are faced with this type of situations. And specifically, social inclusion is a topic that we can address, and we can try to make sure that we have products and services that address this type of situation too, namely related with climate. I don't know if people are aware, but only 25% of the costs that are related with environment, so extreme climate events in Europe, are insured. In Portugal, it's between 5 and 20%. So this is for sure a critical topic to be discussed, and we are discussing Europe. If I go to Latin America or Africa, you can imagine the gap. It's called the protection gap that we are discussing. So we define this as a critical topic to address because the most vulnerable are the ones that are more exposed and are less protected. And also on the climate topic, so we are working both on mitigation and adaptation, and mitigation is a very concrete adverse impact that we can have. An insurance company has both the insurance business but also investments, huge investments. Just Fidelidade has 17 billion euros invested worldwide. So we need to make sure that we make all the efforts to make sure that we reduce, obviously, our carbon footprint, to reduce the negative impact that we can have in the environment. But I just came from COP, and it's something that is very discussed there, although it's very difficult to have concrete answers how to do it. But we need to make the transition, but we shouldn't forget that this needs to be a just transition. And just give you a specific example, if I try to reduce the carbon footprint in a motor insurance, probably I will benefit electric cars. It's a very easy thing to do. But then if I do that, obviously the electric cars are mainly on richer people. So is this just? This is not just. Should I include this type of schemes in the pricing of the insurance? Should I not? So this is the type of discussions that we are having internally. So we are trying to reduce adverse impacts in environment without harming social topics. And you can imagine that this is not an easy way to think about it. So I'll just leave you with 5 actions that we are doing and 3 challenges that we are facing. As I said, we are in a financial company. And unlike other industries, as I was mentioning, we have a very indirect interaction with our stakeholders, namely our clients. So for us to make sure that we do products and services that are aligned and that respect the best practices, we need to understand all industries, and evaluate each client in each industry. So we need to be actually an expert in every kind of industry that there is. So it's a tough challenge for us. But regarding the actions, the first one is we worked on the product side. So we have a sustainable policy in place, so that makes sure that every time we build a product, an insurance product, that it encompasses all the ESG topics. And we are actually, our regulator hasn't defined what is a sustainable insurance. So it doesn't exist. So we have come up ourselves with a methodology to assess our products. And as I was mentioning, social inclusion is the key topic. So we are working on product accessibility, especially on the Global South, because we are present in Angola, Mozambique, Peru, Chile, Bolivia. These are all countries that obviously have a much higher social inclusion aspect that we need to address than in Portugal. The second one is the investments. As I said, it's a relevant topic in an insurance company, so we have an investment sustainable policy in place. that respects both SFDR, that's a regulation that we need to comply that has principal adverse impacts embedded, also the EU taxonomy, but basically that makes sure that we not only reduce our carbon footprint, but that we reduce all our negative impacts, but mostly increase the positive impacts. Then on the procurement side, because although we are not producing items, we buy things. Just to give you examples, we are the largest buyer of healthcare services in Portugal. We are probably the largest payer of car repair. So we have a lot of suppliers that we work with. So the procurement side is also huge for us. And in terms of our commercial network, we started with a concrete task that it was to train our network of agents, so the people that are selling the insurances. Because we can't talk about adverse impacts on social and environment with these type of people that have no idea what we are talking about. So we need to start with the simple things and then move on with concrete examples of what they should do and what they shouldn't do, and we have a code of conduct for our suppliers and partners. The fourth activity was to build an impact center for climate change. This is something that we have just released this year and that will study the impacts of climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. And to do so, we have partnered with a number of experts from universities, NGOs, that help us understand what are the topics that we should be studying and how should we embed this in our business day to day. Again, not forgetting in a just way. And on the adaptation side, basically what we are trying to do is to reduce this protection gap I was mentioning that is huge and people are not fully aware. And when we see floods in Spain, I imagine how much costs are not insured. This is a social problem. Usually governments need to step in, but we know that they will not be able to pay everything. So it's something that we are working on. And lastly, risk prevention. So insurers are not only risk transfer mechanisms. So, okay, I have a cost, I can ask the insurer to pay me, but we also need to work on the risk prevention, so risk management, because before I have an environmental impact or a social impact, I need to prevent, and insurers are very good, as you were mentioning, to assess risk. So these are all risks, and we should be have an active role there. In terms of barriers, just to end, I would highlight the policy complexity and coherence. I'm the head of sustainability. I spend my day talking about 100 topics different with all the divisions in the company. It's very tough to understand CSRD, SFDR, EU taxonomy, CS-DDD. So it's just to know everything that is under each one. And then the interrelations between themselves, it's a very, very difficult challenge. And we are then exposed to other geographies that may have their own specific regulations. The second one is data availability, because we can want to assess everything that we want, but we don't have the data. How can I say if a repair shop in Braga with 3 people are respecting human rights? In concrete, how do I do that? Do I ask him? Obviously, they will not tell me that they are not. So how can we do that in concrete? And lastly, the third topic is to include this in day-to-day, in investments, in insurance, in procurement, in all the activities. So we know that we are not doing enough, but we are trying to, and we are putting a lot of resources on it.
Thank you so much. So the way we thank you, João, for giving us some insights on what Fidelidade is doing, and also some challenges that you're working with on a daily basis. So the way we had planned with this panel is to have a small panel discussion. Obviously, we're out of time for that, so instead, I want to just recap a few points that that emerged from this discussion. I think that the first point that we started also with Caroline's intervention is obviously engaging meaningfully with stakeholders is essential for developing appropriate measures to addressing adverse impacts. Now, those who are the most vulnerable, those who are the most affected, are also the least influential. They're also perhaps the furthest away from the decision makers in the firm. So that relates also to Joao's point about data availability. How do you end up gathering? How do you collect data? Who needs to collect data? Well, the business has a role in that, but they can also probably that role is shared amongst different actors of society, and well, civil society is already doing a lot, but so collaboration, I guess, is the conclusion here, that collaboration between different sectors can help with the implementation of can help with the development of these appropriate measures, at least. Something else that came out was that there's a new legislative framework. Now there's still clarity and coherence that is needed. First, of course, policy coherence is something that that you mentioned, Joao, and also we mentioned this morning, is important to see clearly what are the requirements. But our other panelists also explained that, well, developing appropriate measures and implementing these appropriate measures cannot go counter to other legislative requirements about, for example, collaboration and antitrust issues. And Olena also mentioned needing clarity on heightened due diligence. So we still have some policy development here that our panelists at least were asking for. I think they also did a really good job at challenging the role of business, both in terms of invisible workers and also these human rights risks that occur in conflict areas. Where's the role of business? Is it the role of business? Is it the role of governments? Whose role is it? Again, we're looking at a requirement for a very collaborative landscape here in addressing those risks that still don't fit exactly, or these impacts that still don't fit exactly under one person or one actor's responsibility. And finally, there were different business solutions that were leveraged here. Incentives are required, business incentives, of course, and then the role of insurance. We learned about this. But also, yeah, getting, when you're starting to implement these requirements, that's when you see what works and what doesn't work. And as what Grace was saying, like, we need to take into account the different implementation challenges that are on the ground, and to try to, in a way, iteratively reintegrate that into the policy development. So that's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much to all the panelists and to the keynote speaker. Now I will open up to the questions from our youth ambassadors, Sofia Braga and Viola Weiss from Nova School of Business and Economics.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all panelists for the valuable insights. My first question will go to Grace. I would like to ask, how can the experiences from implementing fair purchasing practices and collaborative agreements in the garment and the apparel sector inform strategies for achieving living wage compliance in other industries with such specific supply chains? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. I think it's a really good one. And actually, there was something I forgot to mention during my presentation, and now I can because you asked that question. So when you get really specific, some of the feedback we've had from suppliers is we are paying a living wage, but we do it in kind. So we don't necessarily pay the numerical value of a living wage according to the methodologies and the calculators, but we pay the minimum wage because we have to, and then we provide transport or we provide food vouchers, and they're saying that sometimes this is 30% of the income. So actually we are paying a living wage. That may very well be the case, but there's this disconnect between brands and purchasing practices and understanding that. So those in-kind payments are not audited. There's no verification that it actually is the monetary value that they're saying it is. And so those questions aren't being asked. They're not coming up in audits. They're not being reviewed. There's just no accountability. And I think, again, it's not a bad intention. I think it's just a disconnect. So when you're as a brand, you're thinking about your purchasing practices, you're thinking about questions to ask, it really is about actually getting into that level of detail, making sure it's in the contracts or your code of conduct or whatever. But if you're not having this dialogue with your suppliers to actually understand what it is they're doing and how they interpret their kind of, that they're meeting their obligations, then you won't even know that in the first place. So I think the first step to ensure that the first step towards responsible purchasing practices is actually a social dialogue with your suppliers. And it's not just factory one in the garment space, tier one suppliers, it's actually beyond, because otherwise it becomes less meaningful if you haven't engaged all of the supply chains. And it also becomes more difficult as you go along the supply chain, because then it becomes a lot more opaque. And you're not sort of dealing with the kind of nice factory floor, but it just becomes a lot more difficult when you're looking at, say, cotton supply and leather supply and things like that. So yeah, I think suppliers need to, brands need to, when they're looking at their purchasing practices, be open to having that conversation with suppliers. That's easier said than done. There's always not a lot of trust. You know, the suppliers, it's a kind of imbalance of power as well. But I think a lot of us in this room understand that and are kind of helping to facilitate those dialogues. And so we understand the reality on the ground. We don't want anyone to lose their jobs or lose contracts or lose business. That doesn't help anyone. And I think we're helping to facilitate those conversations.
Okay, thank you so much. My second question will go to Olena. It's possible, right? I don't know if you can hear me, but given the iron risk and all the challenges business face in risky areas, how can companies ensure that their human rights due diligence is sufficiently adaptive and context-specific to avoid these guys exacerbating conflicts in those regions? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a complicated question how they can be sure that they are doing in a good way. Yeah. No. Again, my response could be just again through the communication with stakeholders first of all, and again. Companies are in very different position if we talk about multinational companies which need to make decisions in very distant way, and local domestic companies which are operating on the ground and which could be in a direct contact with affected stakeholders or with stakeholders which are in the very high risk to be affected. So so I don't have again a solution what kind of tools or what kind of instruments could be used to be sure, but the general approach is the same, that we are connection with the stakeholders.
So much.
Thank you very much also from my side. I would have a question to Jenny. How can companies track their impact on invisible workers and ensure transparency in addressing their needs?
Yeah, hi business students. I'm glad to see you here. So I think that it starts with maybe numbers. So maybe this is something that is part of an attitude or an engagement survey, just to get a feel for the solutions that people are patching together to be able to sustainably come to work every day and care for situations that are crises that arise in families when those occur. But I think the numbers probably only take us so far. I think that companies who are really interested in making a difference in this way would also conduct focus groups and try to understand the individual deep level issues that are at play here. And then maybe start looking at options for bringing people in-house and what that means, and designing creative solutions. So it doesn't have to be a super expensive daycare facility that opens them up to all sorts of risk and potential huge costs, basically, for doing that sort of thing. But it could be creative systems like this could be like a cafeteria style option that they could pick from, for example. I know that the EU countries are supposed to be doing very well in terms of providing these sorts of welfare state benefits, but anecdotally we know that there are many shortcomings, and so companies can get involved in understanding what those shortcomings are.
Okay, thank you very much. My second question is for João. What are the biggest challenges in integrating ESG practices into procurement, especially in the global south?
Well, thank you very much. I think we even don't need to go to Global South. I was actually started the day with discussing procurement in Portugal. So we have more than 200,000 micro and small and medium enterprises in Portugal. If I'm dealing with this type of companies with 2 employees, 10 employees, they will not for sure have a sustainability person, a human rights person, nobody actually, and probably they are not even looking to these topics. So I think what we need to do firstly, and especially to the suppliers where we have a share. So in some suppliers we have 50% of their revenues depend on us. So on those suppliers we are the responsible for them to do the right thing. And I think we need always to start with teaching them on the topic, providing them the knowledge of what are we discussing here, why is this important, and also showing them that this is not only relevant in their relationship with us, but with the relationship with all the clients they have. And if they understand that this is a business discussion, this is not a corporate social responsibility discussion, they will understand that if this is the right to play. If I don't have this type of mechanisms in place, I will not be able to sell. It's not the question of if I will sell with a higher price or lower price. If I'm in business in 10 years or I'm not. If we go to the Global South, then the discussion is even tougher. But again, the path needs to be the same. We need to engage with them. We need to show them why this is relevant in a constructive way, step by step, not complicating it. Because even in Portugal, if I talk to my board and start explaining them all the CSRD or CSDDD, all the implications of it and all the details, their span of attention is like 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, how can I explain this type of things? If I'm talking with the head of procurement, and I will end with the same thing as I said. If I put in the head of procurement incentives related with this, then he worries. If the only incentive he has is reduce costs and make the suppliers more efficient and not having anything related with ESG, I'm sure he will not be worried about this, even if he's a nice guy, because he's being asked for other things, not this. So incentives is always a good way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our speakers for this great conversation. Thank you for your questions, youth ambassadors. Please join me in thanking the speakers. I believe we have a coffee break at the moment, yes? Perfect, so you can get refreshments, should be available.
Join me in thanking our chair. Thank you, Alison. So we have half an hour coffee break, then we'll have the last panel and the concluding session.